Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I hope you're all excited to learn about manatees and seagrass. Tonight, I will be presenting along with my coworker, Dr. Beth Brady. All right, so let's start our presentation on manatees and seagrass, Seagrass 101. So what is seagrass? What are seagrasses? Seagrasses are the only flowering plants that grow in marine, aka saltwater environments. So they're fully adapted to live underwater, though some species of grass can be exposed to the air during the daytime. They're typically found in shallow coastal waters and estuaries worldwide. So an estuary is where freshwater and saltwater meet to form brackish water. Seagrasses evolved from land plants around 140 million years ago and recolonized the ocean from land. And they're called grasses because many species have long, narrow leaves that resemble grasses. Because they're plants, seagrasses need to photosynthesize for food and energy, which is why they're found in these coastal waters that are typically shallow and clear. Here's a map of the global distribution of seagrasses. You can see that there are species all over the world. Here in Florida, we have 7 species of seagrass, but there are around 60 species of seagrass worldwide. And researchers are still doing genetic testing on a lot of these species to see if they're related or if there's more species than we think. The most species ever found in one place was in Papua New Guinea, and they have 13 species there. These are our 7 species of seagrass. We have turtle grass, shoal grass, manatee grass, widgeon grass, stargrass, paddlegrass, and Johnson seagrass. In some areas of the state, they have one type of grass over the other. The Indian River Lagoon, for example, the most common type of grass there is the Halodule wrightii, or the shoal grass. And manatees eat all 7 species of grass. Here's an example of when you go out in a coastal estuary or a bay, you'll see that as you're swimming along a seagrass bed, the species of grass can change. And that's because some grasses prefer water that's more saline or deeper, and others do better in shallower, calmer environments. So, and actually what's very interesting is widgeon grass, which is the one up on the left-hand side, is actually not considered a true seagrass because it can also occur in freshwater, in rivers and lakes as well. It's considered a salt-tolerant freshwater grass, but a lot of people refer to them all together. So what do seagrasses need to grow? Because seagrasses are plants, they need to photosynthesize. And photosynthesis is a plant using sunlight to create food. To do this, seagrasses need high light availability, carbon dioxide, soft, stable sediments. So you're not going to find seagrass on a rocky shore, for example, because they need sandy sediments. Ample nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphorus, and then protection from wave action, which is why we find a lot of these grasses in protected bays. So how does photosynthesis work? Seagrass has special cells called chloroplasts, and these chloroplasts use energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen that they use for growth. Because they live in the water, instead of taking in that CO2 from the air like terrestrial plants do, seagrasses take in that carbon dioxide from the water column and turn it into energy. Seagrasses have actually evolved so that they can't support their own weight of their leaves. Like we know grasses, the grass stands straight up, but seagrasses can't do that. So they actually support their own weight with the buoyancy of the water. And seagrass has roots that go underneath the sediment or the sandy bottom that absorb these nutrients. Seagrass reproduces asexually and sexually. Asexual reproduction is essentially cloning. So they will grow a rhizome, which is a thick root that goes underneath the sediment and spread it out this way and then grow new shoots coming up that way. And so if you see a seagrass bed, that can all be made up of one plant that has reproduced by creating these new roots and shoots. When seagrass grows over large areas, they create a habitat called a seagrass meadow. And seagrass meadows are considered prairies of the sea. They're one of the most productive ecosystems in the world, and they support thousands of different species and provide food sources and habitat for all kinds of wildlife. In North America, sea bass Seagrass beds are often dominated by just one species, while I mentioned before in other areas of the world, they can have multiple species. And seagrass beds can all be made up of one plant. So this is something that came out just a little while ago, that they found that the world's largest plant is one gigantic seagrass bed that covers over 70 square miles in Australia, which is really cool to know that this is all just one clone, one big plant. Seagrass also reproduces by sexual reproduction. So there'll be a male flower that will pollinate a female flower, but it takes place underwater. And you know how we have bees and other insects that will pollinate flowers on land? Well, there are actually creatures that will do this underwater, like crustaceans or worms that will travel between different grass beds and move that pollen. And you can see a crustacean or like a tiny shrimp in one of these flowers. And then the female flower, when it is pollinated, it'll create a fruit, and that fruit will have a seed, and that seed will float. Their adaptation to living in water is that their seeds float on the surface. And different seagrass will have different periods of time, how long a seed can float for. You guys, if you've ever been on the coast, you might have seen that mangroves have seed pods that float on the surface. It's very similar, except seagrass seeds are really small, sometimes hard to see with the naked eye. But they'll float on the surface and travel to a new location, and then eventually they'll sink and settle into the sediment and form a new grass bed. Seagrass is considered a carbon sink, which essentially means that it holds on to carbon. So in the way that rainforests are considered very productive ecosystems, seagrass are also very productive ecosystems. The world's ocean actually holds a lot of carbon dioxide. And when seagrass uses that carbon dioxide, it absorbs carbon from the water, which actually ends up pulling carbon from the air as well, because carbon dioxide in the air will actually diffuse into the water. And then seagrass stores that carbon in its tissues and in the sediment underneath the roots, and it creates this carbon sink. So that reduces the total amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which can slow down climate change. So a really big issue is if you have a lot of seagrass that dies, it releases that carbon back into the ocean, and then it can go back into the atmosphere. So it's estimated that there's over 2 million acres of seagrass found along Florida's coastlines and estuaries. And one of the most significant areas with seagrass is the Nature Coast Aquatic Preserve, which is on the west coast of Florida. It's over 800 square miles and has approximately 400,000 acres of seagrass. So why is seagrass important beyond being a carbon sink? Seagrass meadows provide food and shelter for thousands of species. They reduce erosion. So erosion is when sediment washes away due to storms. And because seagrass has these immense root systems that hold down that sediment, it stops it from being churned up. It also provides coastal storm protection, so the leaves reduce waves. You could see a wave will go across a seagrass bed and it'll slow down, and that prevents those waves from crashing on the shore. They enhance water quality, so the leaves absorb bacteria and nutrients, so they clean the water the way that terrestrial plants clean the air, and they slow the speed of climate change by absorbing CO2. Thousands of species depend upon seagrass to survive, and meadows act as a nursery habitat for many species. So a nursery habitat is an area where the young of a species, so that can be crabs, fish, sea turtles, they will go in those habitats because they're protected from waves and they're able to hide within the leaf blades from predation. So it increases their likelihood of surviving to adulthood. In Florida, seagrass beds are nursery for snapper, sheep's head, red drum, spiny lobsters, and stone crabs, a lot of commercially important species. And these species also move between mangroves, seagrasses, and coral reefs throughout their lifetime. So there's connectivity between all of these habitats. And seagrass is the primary food source for sea urchins, fish, especially parrotfish and pinfish, sea turtles, and manatees. Manatees in Florida eat over 60 different species of aquatic plants. They're considered generalist herbivores, but seagrass makes up the majority of their diet. They eat about 1/10 of their body weight in plants every day, so that's a lot of seagrass. And manatees eat all 7 species of seagrass in Florida. Seagrass habitat as a whole throughout the state is considered critically important for manatees, meaning that manatees depend upon this habitat being available to survive. And manatees co-evolved with seagrass. So something that I hear every now and again is that manatees are eating all the seagrass, right? That's the reason seagrass is disappearing. And we just know that that's not true. The way that manatees feed on grass is they actually snip the grass blades as they go. They're not pulling out the entire root ball. So what happens if you end up with a grass bed that has algae growing on it and things like that, when the manatees come through and they snip that grass, it allows new grass to grow, and that grass will be healthier than the grass that was there before. So it encourages new growth in these grass beds. And manatees also produce waste then those wastes have nutrients that other organisms need in order to grow. So they are a part of the ecosystem, and the seagrass and manatees evolved over time together. So a lot of you may be aware that Florida is losing its seagrass. Since 2012, Tampa Bay has lost around 16% of its seagrass. Sarasota Bay lost around 18%. Florida Bay lost more than 60 square miles between 2014 and 2016, and the Indian River Lagoon has lost 58% of its seagrass since 2009. And what does losing seagrass mean for Florida, for all the animals that live here? It means losing important nursery habitat for fish, sea turtles, and manatees, losing food sources for endangered species, declines in water quality. When seagrass dies, especially in a large amount, all of those nutrients that were in the grass beds end up back in the marine environment and can cause algal blooms, but it also decreases water quality. And over time, if you're getting a lot of sediment in an area, it doesn't settle out because there's nothing holding it down to the bottom. Less protection from storms, and then that reduction in being able to hold on to carbon. So what's killing Florida's seagrasses? There are a lot of things. In the Florida Keys, a really big one is prop scarring. So a prop scar is when a boat comes through and there isn't enough space between the props and the grass, and it ends up killing the grasses in there. It can take years for grasses to recolonize those areas, and you end up with these deep scars, seagrass scars. Extreme weather. So a really strong hurricane could rip up grasses and take a while for those grasses to come back. Freshwater runoff. So as you saw, seagrasses are adapted to saltwater environments. So if you get a lot of rain, a lot of runoff, fresh water coming into a habitat, the seagrass can't cope, and sometimes it will die. Aging infrastructure. So septic tanks, for example, they will leach nutrients into the marine environment just because they're old, or they'll overflow because they can't handle the amount of water coming in. And that can, again, impact the grasses. Discharges from Lake Okeechobee is a big one, especially in the St. Lucie estuary, because the water that's in Lake Okeechobee has a ton of nutrients in it, and it can spark algal blooms. And then we're going to go into more about Hargal algal as a whole. So what are algal blooms? Algae is a plant-like organism that lives in the water. It makes food the same way that plants do, but they don't have stems or leaves, like those hard structures. Algae is always in the ecosystem. It's actually a natural part of the system. A lot of filter feeding marine animals rely on it, so clams, for example. But when algae grows out of control, then it can cause issues. And when algae is growing out of control, that's what's called an algal bloom. And that can be caused by warm temperatures, but most often it's caused by excess nutrients. And that comes from freshwater runoff, from our lawns, from agriculture, nutrients from septic tanks, and all of those things can cause algae to grow out of control. Why are they harmful beyond just growing out of control? So when they do grow like this, you can see the photos here on the slide, that will block light to not just seagrass, but other aquatic plants that need light in order to grow. And then when the algae uses all the nutrients, which it often does, then it no longer can grow and it ends up dying itself. And that algae will sink to the bottom of an estuary or a bay and smother all of the plants that are there. But the decomposition, so the process when the algae starts to break down, uses oxygen, so it'll also use all of the oxygen in the water. And while Seagrasses don't need oxygen to photosynthesize directly from the water. They do need oxygen where their roots are in order to survive. So if there's no oxygen, they also can't survive. And a lot of harmful algal blooms can create toxins like red tide, for example. The Indian River Lagoon is a big focus area for us because it's critically important for manatees. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the unusual mortality event that has been taking place the last couple of years. The Indian River Lagoon is 156 miles long, and it makes up 40% of Florida's east coast. And a lot of the lagoon doesn't have access to the ocean, so the water that's inside the lagoon doesn't flush. So any nutrients that end up in there sit there for a long time. And what happened starting in 2010 is we started seeing recurring algal blooms happen pretty much every 2 years since then, and completely blocking out light to any of the grasses that were there. And over time, over the last 10 years, the Indian River Lagoon has lost over 40,000 acres of seagrass due to these algal blooms. So you can see the photo in 2013, all of that dark color is seagrass. And in 2020, it's just sand. A lot of the Indian River Lagoon still looks like this, but there has been some grass coming back. But what happened is between 2020 and 2022, manatees started starving and dying in large numbers. And that's because during the wintertime, manatees go to the Cape Canaveral Energy Center, which is a power plant that creates warm water, but there's also other areas as well. And manatees can access the Indian River Lagoon from Blue Spring. Manatees are in the Indian River Lagoon year round, but during the wintertime, they need to access warm water in order to survive. They're actually adapted for the tropics. And when water temperatures drop, they'll end up with something close to hypothermia. So they're pretty much restricted to these warm water sites during the wintertime. And they're only able to leave for short periods of time in order to find food. And as you can imagine, it must require a lot of energy in order to stay warm, but also leave that warm water and find food. And what was happening was they were leaving this warm water site and not finding any food. And manatees started dying in large numbers from starvation. So in winters of 2021 and 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, FWC, and the Cape Canaveral Energy Center worked together to feed manatees in a very limited trial at the Cape Canaveral Energy Center. And they had over 800 manatees at the intake one year when they were feeding. They were providing lettuce. And the reason for this is because the northern Indian River Lagoon was where most of the manatees were dying and had the highest number of rescues. And there are facilities all over the state that rescue animals and care for them when they're ill. And they were full, beyond capacity, additional tanks open to take all these animals, and they were still full. So something needed to be done to reduce the number of animals that were dying and coming in. And with no idea of when the grasses would come back, this was a short trial to see if providing food would help. Thankfully, last summer, seagrass started to come back in the Mosquito Lagoon, which is the northernmost region of the Indian River Lagoon. Some areas have up to 90% coverage, which is amazing. It's thought that there was a seed bank. So I said before that seagrass, they can produce seeds, and those seeds settle in the sediment. Not a lot is known about seagrass seeds because they're so small, and you'd need to know what you were looking for because you're not just going to swim and see them. But the thought was that there was a seed bank underneath the sediment that was undetected. And there's been a lot of work going on in the Indian River Lagoon to improve water quality, updating septic tanks to reduce leaks, improving stormwater infrastructure, reducing fertilizer. And the water quality in the Indian River Lagoon has been incredible. And the last 2 summers, we've had some grass come back, and in some areas, it's really dense. I actually went out around a week and a half ago and got to go see it for myself. And these are some of the pictures from there. And we've seen upwards of 800 animals in this area of the lagoon feeding on the grasses up there. So what's been happening is when wintertime comes around, these animals are healthier and in a better spot to survive the winter while they're kind of restricted to these warm water sites. So what is being done to help manatees while seagrass hasn't come back in all of the lagoon? The Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership is a group of nonprofits, agencies, zoos, and aquariums that all work together to rescue, rehabilitate, return and research manatees in Florida. So throughout the entire unusual mortality event, there were multiple people, multiple groups all over the state working together to rescue these animals, to figure out where they're going and make a plan for what would be coming in the future years. We've had quite a few animals that were rescued during the unusual mortality event that have been returned to the wild after having care. There are also many groups, agencies, nonprofits, universities, all working together to restore the lagoon. So doing seagrass surveys, transects to see how the grass is doing and collect that data, because we can learn over time how what we do to reduce nutrients going into the lagoon, how it's making a difference in these grasses coming back. There are groups that are doing clam plantings. Clams help to filter water and reduce nutrients. There's about 5 facilities right now that are growing seagrass on land in tanks to be planted back out into the lagoon. These are called seagrass nurseries. And there are groups that are out there planting as well. This is a burlap mat that seagrass can be attached to and then put in the sediment, and then the grasses will grow from that. What's interesting is seagrass can actually be grown from fragments. So just the leaf itself without the roots, if you put that in some sediment, it'll grow. It's been very exciting for restoration. We're also expanding our partnerships on the East Coast to help support these restoration efforts. We've provided funding for citizen science. We are out there doing some drone work, and we're out helping with rescues and releases of manatees. This is a photo that was taken over the Cape Canaveral Energy Center around 2 years ago that showed over 1,000 animals in the lagoon. And we're working with partners to use drones to figure out if we can measure manatee body condition. So if a manatee is healthy or not from drone footage, because that could give us a better sense of how the population as a whole is doing. Unfortunately, the year before the unusual mortality event started, when manatees started dying, was COVID. And every year, researchers go out and do manatee health assessments where they'll capture a few manatees and measure their fat thickness, take blood samples, and just get a general sense of how the population is doing. And that wasn't able to happen that year. So it could be that we might have had some advance notice as to what was going on if we had been able to go out, but because of COVID, things weren't happening. Now, this is going to be a section that Dr. Beth Brady is going to be presenting on. This is some drone work that she has been working on to look at seagrass. So Beth, if you could turn your camera on and join us, and I will click through the slides for you.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for hanging around, everyone. So part of the drone project that Tiare just mentioned, using drones to look at body condition of manatees, I assisted with and spearheaded. So drones can be used for a lot of different applications. We've been using them to help us find and rescue animals. If you're on a boat, it's much more difficult to see an animal than when you can see it from the air. We also use, like I said, to look at body condition. And then we were interested in looking at seagrass. So what about seagrass? So Florida Fish and Wildlife, which is FWC, and FWRI, which is the Florida Research Institute, looks at seagrass growth in Florida along with their partners, but their records aren't always current. So sometimes the water management districts in these areas and Florida Fish and Wildlife, they look at seagrass, and they look at it usually from an airplane, and they do this about every 2 years. They do a survey. I think you can go forward a little bit. I think some of those other comments I'm saying are on there. Yeah. So exactly. So the South Florida Water Management District conducts aerial surveys every 2 years. So we were wondering, well, what happens in between those times? How much does the seagrass fluctuate during those time frames? Additionally, we also noted with a loss of seagrass, we got a lot more of a macroalgae called caulerpa. Now, caulerpa is native to Florida, but we noticed that in areas where we lost seagrass, we got a lot more caulerpa, and it seemed to be like overtaking or outcompeting the seagrass. So we wanted to be able to monitor not not only seagrass, but also changes in seagrass if we were getting more of this macroalgae than the seagrass. So to do that, we knew that we could use drones to take imagery of seagrass. Next slide, please. So that's perfect. So we use commercial complement these surveys and use support mapping efforts. So we use off-the-shelf DJI drones. They're relatively inexpensive. We were able to fly these. There are also other different types of drones that you can use. There is some free software that you can use to map, and some more expensive softwares that you can potentially use and map the results I'm going to be sharing with you today. Next slide, please. So one of the areas that we did it was at Mote Marine Laboratory. There's a little site right off of Mote in Sarasota that had a very small seagrass bed. So we did flights once a month from October through November 2023. So this is what we call autonomous mapping, meaning you automatically program the drone, and the drone will just automatically stop and hover at different points, and it will map as large or as small of an area as you like. So you are limited just by battery capacity, how many batteries you have. So one flight would last approximately 20 minutes and you would use one battery. And that could cover potentially like a quarter, not a very large, it's different areas. So one of the areas that I'm going to show you here took me about 3 batteries to do. It took about a lot of images we'll get into in the next slide, but there's some larger areas that took about 4 or 5 batteries to cover and take all these images. So I think you can go to the next slide. Oh, and that's the site we were talking about. So if you go to the first slide, so what you get from the drone is a series of successive images. So if you can click on the next slide for me. So these are a couple different images that it takes in succession. It continually takes these over and over and over again. It basically takes anywhere from 400 to 800 pictures, and then it takes and put them all together. It's called an orthomosaic, and puts it into one orthorectified image that you can see right there. So this is the area that we saw at Mote. We were able to look at the seagrass over the course of a year and how it fluctuated. So we did some fancy statistical analyses, and to make a long story short, we basically saw that there was very small fluctuations over the course of a year, some more drastic than others. You would lose more seagrass during the winter months and gain more in the summer months. But we just wanted to verify the process. So now we can take this, and we can take this to larger areas, and we can monitor key sites. So we not be able to do like a whole very large area, but we can look at a key site within one location, be able to look at that and see how the seagrass is doing in that specific area. The next slide.
That's it, I think.
That might go back into you. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. It's been very exciting to get to work with Beth on these projects and learn a lot about the different applications for drones. While some drones can be expensive, it's nothing compared to how much an aerial survey would cost, which is hiring a plane and a pilot to go up and fly, it's very difficult to reschedule those. While if you have a drone and a permit, just to clarify, a lot of this work you need a permit to do. You can get the data pretty quickly and then use software to analyze. You wanted to add something, Beth, to that?
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to say, so where we're flying these drones are at a height of about 50 feet. When we fly over marine mammals, those images that you saw were from 100 meters, right? 60 to 100 meters is the minimum at which we fly over marine mammals. So if you see anyone flying lower that you can actually hear it, they're probably doing something that's potentially harassing or disturbing the animal.
A big part
to keep in mind.
A big part of what we do, the research that we're working on with looking at manatee body condition, is we don't want to disturb any of these wild animals, especially if they're already immunocompromised or underweight. So a big part of that is following the minimum standards and making sure we're flying at a height that doesn't disturb the animals. And a lot of times, if you're not proficient in flying a drone, the way that you fly it can make it louder. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're out there flying. And a lot of people that do this work professionally and researchers, they spend a lot of time, they have a lot of hours that they're flying to make sure that they're doing it in a way that is not disturbing wild animals. So thank you, Beth. I just wanted to go over a few more things that are being done in the Indian River Lagoon. So Governor DeSantis approved $53 million in grants to improve water quality in the lagoon. And the grants were used to replace 3,000 septic tanks and update wastewater treatment plants and reducing overall nutrients entering the Indian River Lagoon. A lot of the algal blooms are fueled by these nutrients. So it's super important that these nutrients be properly removed from the system. And then the IRL, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, covers the entire Indian River Lagoon and gives out grants to different groups to help them with seagrass plantings, setting up a seagrass nursery, doing research. There's still a lot that we don't know about seagrass. You know, like there's different types of sediments. Sometimes the bottom can be softer or more sandy. And why is it that seagrass grows in one location and not the other? The lagoon as a whole, because it's so big, you'll have different areas dealing with different issues. So sometimes the middle of the Indian River Lagoon will have really high salinity. So it'll be really salty in one area. And sometimes that can kill clams in that area. But then just a mile down the lagoon, you'll have great water quality. And a lot of that has to do with the bridges that were built that cross the lagoon that can reduce the flow of that water, but then also not having a lot of access to flushing from the inlets. So just because a project works in one area doesn't mean it works in another area. And so all of the partners that work throughout the lagoon work together to share that data and talk about what they're learning so that they're not reinventing the wheel, but they can also share any new discoveries that can help them do a better job in restoring the lagoon. In 2023, we partnered with the Marine Resources Council to bring together seagrass nursery growers, scientists, advocates, and resource managers for a 2-day assembly to talk about the different work that's going on in seagrass restoration, what knowledge gaps there might be, what are additional studies that need to be done, what permits are needed, just getting all of the experts together in one room to talk about all of these issues. And then a white paper, so a report was published with all of the key findings and takeaways from that meeting so that can be used as a resource for all of these managers. So what can you as a member of the public do to help manatees? So if you live in Florida, this is good practice even if you don't live in Florida. But if you live in Florida, you'd be surprised how far away you can live from a water body but still impact the water quality there. So Florida has an aquifer underneath us, and the water gets in there from the rainwater. So rain comes down and percolates or goes through our sediment and ends up in the aquifer. And if you fertilize and that ends up in rainwater, that can end up back in the aquifer. But it can also run off from your property into a canal, into a river, and all of those things make their way back to our coastal ecosystems, our estuaries and bays. So if you don't have to fertilize, we always recommend that you don't. And if you are going to fertilize, don't fertilize during the rainy season because it is going to wash off your lawn and end up in our waterways. Try to be active in your community. So if you can volunteer for any local restoration events, if someone's doing clam plantings or seagrass planting or mangrove plantings, all of that can be super helpful to get involved. You can learn if there's a local group out there collecting any seagrass fragments if you live on the lagoon or any other waterway. And you can help by volunteering for Save the Manatee Club at our outreach events and providing information to people who might not know that manatees are everywhere, which is something that not a lot of people realize, and how much they depend upon healthy waters and seagrasses. You can help protect the marine environment for watching for seagrass if you're out on your boat. By wearing polarized sunglasses especially, it can be very difficult to see wildlife in the water when you're boating. Always have a spotter on your boat, someone at the front who's keeping an eye out. If you ever do end up boating over a seagrass bed and you get stuck, the best thing to do is to lift up your motor. And if you have a pole, you can just push your way out versus ripping up the seagrass beds. As I said before, it takes a really long time for these grasses to recover. if there is a scar. So it's very important that you don't cause additional damage. And also look at any maps when you're out there. So you're following the manatee protection zones, but also following any seagrass protection zones, or knowing where the deepest part of the channel is and staying in the deepest part of the channel. Also, throwing away and recycling any fishing line is especially important for protecting manatees, but other animals that can become entangled. If you ever see a sick, injured, or a dead manatee, you can report it to the FWC Wildlife Alert Hotline, and that number is here on this slide. You can help manatees by donating to Save the Manatee Club, adopting a manatee, or as I said before, volunteering with us. And you can learn more about algal blooms and seagrass and the different efforts going on around the state at our website. Additionally, if you are in Florida or even outside of Florida and you live on a waterway and you see a healthy manatee, you can report it to our manatee sighting form. So we have a manatee sighting form where you can put in the exact location you saw the animal, the behavior they were doing. So if they were feeding, traveling, nursing a calf, anything like that, you can put that into our form, and that goes directly to our database, and I see every single sighting that comes in. And we use that to figure out if there's areas of the state that aren't protected, that manatees need additional protection. There are some areas where we know manatees are there, but there's no data, and the data is really important for helping us to protect these animals. And if you happen to see people violating manatee speed zones or anything like that, you can also report that in our form. And it's very important that this not be used for sick or injured animals, that those be reported to the wildlife hotline. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.